Matthew Johnson had everything most people could only dream of. As a millionaire, his life was filled with luxury, exclusive dinners, private jets, and a mansion so large it was easy to get lost inside. But life has a curious way of changing when you least expect it. And for Matthew, that change came brutally. That morning, he woke up as usual, surrounded by the comfort his fortune provided. The mansion was silent. The fresh aroma of coffee lingered in the air, and the day seemed to promise yet another series of meetings and important decisions. He had no idea that in just a few hours, his world would be turned upside down. On a stretch of road, while driving his sports car, everything happened. A loud screech of brakes pierced the silence, followed by a crash that seemed endless. Matthew's car flipped over several times before coming to rest on the shoulder, completely wrecked. By the time the sirens arrived, he was unconscious, and his life would never be the same. When Matthew opened his eyes, he didn't recognize where he was. Bright lights and muffled voices filled the space. "Matthew, can you hear me?" asked a woman by his bedside. She seemed familiar, but he had no idea who she was. The feeling was terrifying. He didn't know where he was, or even who he was. It was as if his very identity had vanished. The hospital felt like a strange, cold place. Unfamiliar faces came and went as doctors asked questions he didn't know how to answer. His mind was clouded with doubts. He wanted to know what had happened, but all he could find was emptiness. It was hard to accept that this once powerful millionaire, always in control, now didn't even know his own name. Emily, who claimed to be his wife, seemed deeply concerned. She held his hand and tried to reassure him. But to Matthew, she was just another stranger. Her eyes radiated kindness, but he couldn't feel anything beyond confusion. Then others arrived. Jason, his brother, seemed more focused on discussing business than checking on his health. And Claire, his assistant, appeared to be the only one genuinely trying to help him. With each new face, Matthew only grew more uncertain. Some people spoke with emotion, others with urgency. He heard words like important documents and critical meetings, but none of it made sense. What struck him most, however, was the nagging feeling that something was off. It was as if everyone around him was hiding something he was supposed to know. The days in the hospital dragged on as Matthew tried to piece his life back together, despite having so few clues. Fragmented images flashed in his mind, meetings, parties, deals, but nothing was clear enough to form a memory. He knew something important was missing, but he couldn't figure out what. When he was discharged, Matthew was taken back to his mansion. It was an enormous, impressive place, but it felt empty, as though it no longer belonged to him. He looked at the art-covered walls and the luxurious furniture, but everything felt distant, as if it all belonged to someone else. He was living a life he didn't recognize. Despite the comfort surrounding him, Matthew felt a growing weight. He knew he needed to figure out who he was, but he also knew he couldn't trust everyone around him. Every glance, every word seemed to carry hidden meanings. He couldn't shake the feeling that his accident wasn't just an accident. There was something more behind it. And so, Matthew began to do what anyone in his situation would: search for answers. But he knew it wouldn't be easy. He was surrounded by people who seemed to care, but there were also hidden agendas at play. He would have to be smart, even without remembering who he was. Deep down, he knew that the answers he sought might change everything. When Matthew Johnson passed through the wrought iron gates of his mansion, he was overwhelmed by a mix of awe and unease. The grandeur of the estate was undeniable: immaculate gardens, elegant fountains, and a facade straight out of a Renaissance painting. Yet nothing about it felt familiar. Emily, his wife, accompanied him with a calculated enthusiasm, pointing out details he was supposed to recognize. "Remember this chandelier? You picked it out yourself in Italy." But Matthew didn't remember. In fact, everything felt as foreign as the faces that surrounded him in the hospital. What should have been a sanctuary felt more like a stage, with him as an actor missing his script. Emily did everything she could to rebuild the life they had supposedly shared. She hosted lavish dinners, invited friends, and filled the house with laughter that never seemed to reach Matthew. He sat at the table, surrounded by smiling faces, but felt like an uninvited guest. Every toast, every conversation echoed in a hollow void. He listened to stories about business achievements, extravagant trips, and adventures he was meant to have experienced, but none of it made sense. The millionaire everyone praised seemed like someone entirely different from him. Jason, his brother, was another peculiar figure in this confusing narrative. He arrived on the very first day, armed with stacks of papers and talking about urgent contracts that required Matthew's signature. "This is important to keep control of the company," he insisted, his urgency bordering on pressure. Still unsure of his situation, Matthew refused to sign anything without first reading and understanding it. Jason's frustration was evident. "You're making things more complicated," he snapped, storming out of the room with a look Matthew couldn't quite read. Something about him felt off, though Matthew couldn't yet figure out why. Among everyone surrounding him, Claire, his assistant, was the only one who seemed genuinely concerned for his well-being. While Emily and Jason were focused on what Matthew could do for them, Claire was discreet and thoughtful. "If you need anything, I'm here," she would say, with a sincere smile. Claire spoke to him in a way that made him feel human again, not just a millionaire everyone wanted to manipulate. There was something comforting about her presence, a rare and authentic connection in a world of facades. As the days passed, Matthew began exploring the mansion in an attempt to recover his memories. The sprawling halls and luxurious rooms were impressive, but stirred no recollections. However, one room stood out: the office. It was an imposing space, with shelves lined with books and a massive dark wood desk. He felt an odd sense of belonging there, as if it was the one place that truly reflected who he was. While rifling through the drawers, he found something unsettling. Handwritten notes with cryptic messages like, "Trust only what your eyes see, and not every smile is sincere." When he showed the notes to Emily, she brushed them off as a prank by the staff. But Matthew wasn't convinced. His relationship with Emily began to sour. She did everything in her power to please him, but Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that her kindness was forced. Her smile seemed to conceal secrets, and her words, though sweet, felt rehearsed. In unguarded moments, he watched her closely, searching for clues about who she really was. He wanted to believe she was on his side, but something in her demeanor made it impossible to trust her completely. What made it worse was the lack of proof, only instincts that grew stronger with each passing day. Jason, on the other hand, made no effort to hide his impatience. He continued to pressure Matthew to sign the documents he claimed were crucial for saving the company. But even without his memory, Matthew knew that impulsive decisions could come at a steep cost. He stalled, saying he needed time to understand what was going on. This infuriated Jason, who left the room slamming doors and muttering words Matthew couldn't quite make out. It was as though Jason was racing against some unseen clock. But for what reason? Meanwhile, Claire remained a steady presence. She helped Matthew with small details in his daily life without prying. When she noticed he was feeling overwhelmed, she said something that stayed with him. "You don't have to have all the answers right now. Just take it one step at a time." Those simple words were a relief. For the first time, Matthew felt like he didn't have to bear the weight of the world on his shoulders. But at the same time, her sincerity made him question the others even more. Why was she the only one who seemed genuinely interested in his well-being? The mansion, for all its grandeur, started to feel suffocating. Matthew felt surrounded by secrets, but didn't know where to look for answers. Every corridor he walked down only raised more questions. Why couldn't he remember anything? Why did everyone around him seem so desperate? And most importantly, who was telling the truth? To regain control of his life, Matthew knew he needed to figure out who the people around him truly were. More than that, he needed to determine which of them had his best interests at heart, and which of them wanted to see him fall. Matthew Johnson knew his situation required caution. He might have lost his memory, but his instincts were intact. Every word, every gesture from the people around him was a piece of a puzzle he couldn't yet assemble. The behavior of Emily, Jason, and even Claire raised questions Matthew didn't know how to answer. But one thing was clear in his mind. Someone wasn't being completely honest. The problem was figuring out who. As days went by, Matthew began to discreetly investigate his own life. He decided to start with the basics, the drawers in his office desk. Among corporate documents, reports, and contracts, he found a manila envelope that seemed out of place. Inside was a photo of him standing next to a woman who wasn't Emily. The woman's enigmatic smile tugged at something deep within Matthew, but he couldn't remember who she was. Still, something about the image felt important, as though she were a key piece of a secret everyone was trying to keep hidden. While grappling with these discoveries, Emily continued playing the role of the devoted wife. She organized dinners, tried to spark his memory with stories from their past, and made a point of staying by his side at every moment. Yet Matthew noticed subtle inconsistencies in her words. One night, she mentioned a trip to Europe they'd taken together, but in another conversation, she gave different details about the same event. This made Matthew suspicious. Was she just trying to fill the gaps in his memory? Or was there something more? Jason, on the other hand, was far less subtle. His insistence that Matthew signed documents he claimed were critical for the company grew more urgent by the day. "You need to trust me," he said, with an urgency that felt almost rehearsed. But Matthew didn't trust him. There was something about Jason that made him uncomfortable. He was too convincing, like a salesman pitching an idea he didn't believe in himself. And why was Jason so desperate to seize control? That question echoed in Matthew's mind every time he saw his brother. Even Claire, the one person who seemed genuine, wasn't immune to his doubts. Despite her calming presence, Matthew began wondering whether she was truly there to help or just another player in a game he didn't yet understand. Once, he caught her typing something frantically on her phone, and when he approached, she quickly put it away. "Sorry, just work," she said with a nervous smile. That moment planted a seed of suspicion. Even Claire, who seemed so trustworthy, might not be who he thought she was. Determined to take control of the situation, Matthew decided to confront Emily. He called her into the office, and with the envelope in hand, asked her about the woman in the photo. Emily's reaction was telling. She looked visibly flustered. "She's an old friend," Emily said, avoiding his gaze. But Matthew could tell there was more to the story. Her hesitation and the tremor in her voice were enough to confirm she wasn't being entirely truthful. He decided not to press her for now, but it was clear Emily had her own secrets. Jason's behavior also became increasingly erratic. One evening, Matthew overheard a conversation between Jason and Emily. They were discussing something related to the company, but when Matthew entered the room, they abruptly changed the subject. "We were just talking about Claire's birthday party," Jason said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Matthew knew it was a lie. Worse, he felt they were deliberately keeping him in the dark. The frustration of not being able to trust anyone began to weigh heavily on Matthew. He felt trapped, as though he were living in a bubble where everyone had ulterior motives. Even the household staff seemed to act differently when he was around. Matthew realized that if he wanted answers, he'd have to find them on his own. He couldn't rely on anyone, not until he understood the true nature of his circumstances. In the midst of this, Matthew had an idea: to seek out old friends or colleagues who might offer clues about his life before the accident. He found a list of contacts on his phone, but most of the numbers were disconnected or went unanswered. However, one name stood out: James Whitaker. Though Matthew didn't know who James was, something about the name felt familiar. He decided to call, and to his surprise, James picked up. "Matthew, you finally decided to call me," James said, his tone both warm and intriguing. The conversation with James was brief but revealing. He mentioned unfinished business and alluded to a deal that had been interrupted for reasons he didn't explain. "We need to talk in person," James said, arranging to meet at a downtown restaurant. Matthew knew the meeting might be risky, but he also knew he had to take chances. James seemed like a crucial piece in unraveling the truth. As he prepared for the meeting, Matthew came to an important realization. He could no longer afford to be passive. It was clear that everyone around him had their own agenda, and he was at the center of it all. The millionaire who once controlled everything was now a victim of games he didn't even understand. But that was about to change. Matthew promised himself that no matter what he uncovered, he would no longer be a pawn in someone else's game. Matthew Johnson felt that every step he took brought him closer to something significant and dangerous. The meeting with James Whitaker was his first decisive move since his life had turned upside down. The restaurant was a discreet, almost hidden spot in a downtown alley, far removed from the glamour that once accompanied the millionaire. James was already there, seated in a corner with an expression that blended worry and relief. "I thought you'd never reach out," he said, shaking Matthew's hand firmly. The conversation started casually, but quickly grew tense. James revealed that before the accident, Matthew had been investigating something within his own company. "You were suspicious that someone was embezzling funds," James explained, his eyes scanning the room as if expecting to be overheard. Matthew listened intently, absorbing every detail. Although he couldn't remember anything, it all made sense. There was a void in his life, a missing piece that seemed directly tied to what James was saying. The most alarming revelation came when James brought up the accident. "Do you really think it was a coincidence?" he asked, leaning in closer. The question hung heavy in the air as Matthew processed its implications. If the accident wasn't random, it meant someone had tried to kill him. But who? And why? A chill ran down his spine. From that moment on, Matthew knew nothing would ever be the same. Back at the mansion, Matthew began watching everything and everyone more closely. He needed to understand who might be involved. Emily continued to play the role of the loving wife, but her attempts to get closer seemed more calculated than genuine. Jason grew increasingly anxious, his requests for signatures escalating into near threats. Even Claire, with her reassuring presence, began to seem more enigmatic. Matthew no longer knew whom to trust. Determined to uncover the truth, Matthew shared some of his suspicions with Claire. "I feel like I'm surrounded by secrets," he admitted. To his surprise, she didn't deny it. "I feel the same way," she replied with a serious look. Claire suggested they start digging into the company's records, searching for inconsistencies or clues that might shed light on what was happening. Matthew hesitated but knew he had no other choice. He needed to act. That night, the two locked themselves in the office and began combing through piles of documents. Financial reports, printed emails, contracts. Everything seemed in order at first glance. But Claire found something that caught her attention. A bank transfer to an unknown account, a sum large enough to raise red flags. "This isn't in the official report," she said, frowning. A wave of anger and frustration surged through Matthew. It was clear someone was stealing from him, and he needed to find out who. The investigation took days, and the tension within the mansion grew. Jason seemed more irritable than ever, while Emily became increasingly withdrawn. Claire uncovered more evidence of irregularities, but every lead seemed to end in a dead end. It was as if someone had meticulously erased their tracks. Still, Matthew knew the culprit was close. He could feel it, even if he lacked concrete proof. In a moment of introspection, Matthew reflected on everything he had learned so far. He realized that the answers were all around him, but they were being carefully hidden. Every conversation, every glance seemed laden with hidden meanings. Matthew resolved to rely on his observations and the few solid facts he had instead of getting lost in speculation. He knew the truth wouldn't come easily, but he was determined not to give up. Claire, meanwhile, seemed increasingly committed to helping him. She suggested they look into older records that might be harder to alter. Matthew agreed, and the two began exploring the company's digital archives. That's when they found something alarming: emails between Jason and a mysterious partner discussing opportunities that seemed directly connected to Matthew's accident. As he read the messages, Matthew felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He wanted to believe that his brother wasn't capable of such cruelty. But the evidence was beginning to pile up. Jason was involved in some way with whatever was happening. The lingering question was, how far was he willing to go to get what he wanted? With every new discovery, Matthew felt closer to the truth, but also more exposed to danger. He knew that continuing to investigate meant stepping into perilous territory. Yet, the idea of backing down was unthinkable. He needed answers, and he knew he could only find them if he was willing to risk everything, even his life. As the days passed, the tension inside the Johnson mansion became almost unbearable. Matthew felt as though he was walking on thin ice, where any wrong move could send him plunging into the depths. After combing through documents with Claire, he began confronting those around him more directly. His first conversation was with Emily. He found her in the library, holding a glass of wine and flipping through a book she seemed barely interested in. "We need to talk," Matthew said firmly. She looked up at him with apparent surprise, but he noticed the slight tremble in her hands. Something was about to surface. Matthew placed one of the suspicious transfers they had uncovered on the table. "Can you explain what this means?" he asked, staring directly at her. Emily tried to deflect. "Matthew, you know I don't handle these things. Jason has always managed the finances," she replied, attempting to appear innocent. But there was something hesitant in her tone, something that made Matthew press further. He stepped closer, locking eyes with her. "Then why is your signature on these documents?" he demanded. Emily went pale, as if the ground had vanished beneath her feet. Cornered, Emily began to talk. She admitted to signing papers at Jason's request, but swore she didn't know what she was really authorizing. "He said it was to protect the company," she explained, her voice shaking. Matthew listened in silence, unsure whether to believe her. It all seemed like a convenient excuse, something to shift blame. But what Emily revealed next was even more alarming. Jason had been attempting to transfer company assets to offshore accounts, claiming it was a form of safeguarding. Matthew knew this could mean only one thing: fraud. Determined to confront his brother, Matthew went to Jason's office. He found him on the phone, speaking in hushed tones. When Jason noticed Matthew, he immediately hung up, forcing a tense smile. You've decided to show up," Jason said, trying to maintain his composure. But Matthew wasn't in the mood for games. "Enough lies, Jason. I know what you're doing," he shot back, slamming the documents onto the desk. Jason's smile vanished, replaced by a hardened expression. "You don't understand what's at stake," he replied, his tone bordering on a threat. The confrontation escalated. Matthew demanded explanations, but Jason only tried to justify his actions, claiming that everything he had done was to protect the company. "You were out of control before the accident, Matthew. I was just trying to save what you were destroying," Jason said, his voice heavy with resentment. But Matthew knew this was just smoke and mirrors. He didn't have enough evidence yet to directly accuse Jason, but it was clear his brother was not just a misguided ally. He was an enemy. The revelations didn't stop there. During another investigation with Claire, they discovered a hidden safe in Matthew's office. Inside was a dossier containing detailed records of illegal operations tied to the company, all signed by none other than Jason. The evidence was damning: illegal transfers, falsified financial reports, and even bribes. Matthew felt a mixture of rage and relief. He finally had something concrete against Jason, but it also meant the final confrontation was closer than ever. The biggest shock came when Matthew confronted Emily again, now armed with the documents from the safe. Visibly frightened, she revealed something that shifted the entire course of the investigation. Jason wasn't acting alone, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He had a partner, someone much more dangerous. Her words hit Matthew like a blow. If Jason wasn't the sole architect of this scheme, who else was involved? And what other secrets were they hiding? Amid all this, Jason vanished. One morning, Claire informed Matthew that his brother had left the mansion during the night, leaving no trace of where he had gone. Matthew knew instantly this was a bad sign. Jason was aware the walls were closing in, and by fleeing, he confirmed his guilt. But it also meant he was likely planning something. Matthew couldn't afford to underestimate him, not now. With Jason out of the picture, Matthew knew he had to act quickly. He called a meeting with the company's top executives and presented part of the evidence he had uncovered. "This isn't just a crisis," he said, staring directly into the stunned faces around the table. "It's a betrayal, and I will do whatever it takes to protect what I've built." The reaction was mixed. Some seemed relieved to finally have answers, while others clearly knew more than they were letting on. Meanwhile, Claire continued to stand by Matthew's side, helping him organize the evidence and formulate a plan to expose Jason and anyone else involved. Yet, amidst the chaos, Matthew began to notice something he had overlooked until now. Despite Claire being his strongest ally, he still didn't know enough about her. And with all the secrets coming to light, he couldn't help but wonder if he could fully trust her. For now, though, she was the only person he could rely on. The puzzle pieces were finally coming together, but Matthew knew the most dangerous part was yet to come. He had exposed part of the truth, but that also meant he had become a target. When Jason disappeared, Matthew knew he couldn't waste any time. He was certain his brother was running to avoid the consequences, but he also seemed to be moving too quickly to leave a clean trail. Together with Claire, Matthew began analyzing the documents they had uncovered from the office and the safe. The first concrete clue came from a recent bank withdrawal notification at a branch near the mansion. Jason might be using this to fund his escape, Claire said, her eyes scanning the report. Matthew decided to follow the money. They contacted the bank, where Claire used her managerial expertise to request more detailed records. The manager hesitated, but Matthew's commanding presence and influential name got them what they needed. The account activity revealed not only the withdrawal, but also a credit card charge at a gas station in a town about 30 miles away. It was a clear movement pattern, and Matthew knew they were on the right track. The records indicated that Jason wasn't traveling far, at least not all at once. He seemed to be making small, cautious moves, perhaps to avoid drawing attention. After the gas station, another charge appeared at a small convenience store in the same town. Matthew and Claire immediately headed there. The store owner, initially hesitant, confirmed that Jason had been there the previous morning, buying supplies and asking about a quiet place to spend the night. He seemed in a hurry but polite, the man said, handing over the receipt. The next step was clear. They needed to find out where Jason was staying. After checking local hotels and inns, they discovered that Jason had used the same credit card to pay for a night at a small cabin in the countryside. When they arrived, however, they found only traces of his presence. Crumpled papers, a still warm coffee mug, and a map of a nearby mountainous region suggested he had already moved on. Matthew turned to Claire, his gaze steely. "He's always one step ahead," he said. "But that won't last." Back in the car, Claire received an important notification. The bank team had traced another recent transaction. Jason had rented a vehicle in a nearby town. This meant he was moving quickly, but also making mistakes. Each use of his card left a trail, and Matthew knew it was only a matter of time before they caught up with him. They drove to the rental agency, where the staff confirmed that Jason had left heading toward a secluded mountain lodge. When they reached the lodge, the signs were clear. Jason was there. The rented car was parked outside, and the glow of a flashlight flickered through a window. Matthew took a deep breath, feeling adrenaline course through his veins. He asked Claire to stay in the car while he confronted his brother. "If anything goes wrong, call for help," he said. She hesitated but nodded, her phone in hand and ready. Inside the lodge, Jason sat at a table, surrounded by papers and maps. When he saw Matthew enter, he didn't look surprised. "I knew you'd find me," he said with an unsettling calm. Matthew, however, had no patience for theatrics. "Do you think you can run forever, Jason? Do you think you can escape the consequences?" he demanded, his voice laced with indignation. Jason only laughed bitterly, his expression twisted with resentment. "I wasn't running, Matthew. I was preparing." What followed was a confrontation charged with emotion. Jason tried to justify his actions, claiming everything he did was to fix Matthew's mistakes. "You risked everything with your arrogance," he said, his words dripping with contempt. Matthew listened in silence, anger boiling inside him. But when Jason reached for a gun, the stakes shifted. The air grew tense, every second stretching into an eternity. "You're not taking this from me," Jason said, his voice trembling. At that moment, Claire entered quietly, her phone in hand. She had already called the police, and the sound of distant sirens distracted Jason just long enough for Matthew to lunge and disarm him. The two brothers struggled, wrestling for control of the weapon, until Matthew finally managed to throw it out of reach. When the police arrived moments later, they took Jason into custody. As he was being led away, he cast one last look at Matthew. "This isn't over," he said ominously. But Matthew knew that, for now, he had won. As the police car disappeared down the mountain road, Matthew turned to Claire, exhausted but resolute. "We still don't know everything," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He understood that capturing Jason was only the beginning. There were still hidden secrets, puzzle pieces that needed to be uncovered. But in that moment, for the first time in a long while, Matthew felt something he had thought lost: control over his own destiny. With Jason in custody and the name Daniel Harrington emerging as the true mastermind behind everything, Matthew knew he had to confront him directly. Daniel wasn't just an old business partner. He was the architect of the scheme to destroy the company and Matthew's life. The evidence found in the documents and Jason's confessions painted a clear path to Daniel. Now aware that the betrayal ran deeper than he ever imagined, Matthew resolved to face his enemy on his own terms. Daniel agreed to the meeting with a confidence bordering on arrogance. The restaurant he chose for the encounter was discreet yet elegant enough to match his inflated ego. When Matthew arrived, he found Daniel seated at the table, wearing a smug smile. "Matthew, what a surprise," Daniel said, raising his wine glass. "I thought you'd still be busy piecing your memory back together." The provocation was obvious, but Matthew didn't react. He was there to play his final card. Matthew sat down calmly, placing a folder of documents on the table. "You orchestrated all of this, Daniel. Manipulated Jason, sabotaged my company, and tried to kill me," he said, cutting straight to the point. Daniel let out a short, derisive laugh. "Oh, Matthew, always so dramatic. Do you really think the company you ran into the ground could have survived without someone like me? I did what had to be done." The cold detachment in Daniel's words made it clear he felt no remorse. To him, this was nothing more than business. Matthew opened the folder, pulling out the evidence piece by piece. Fraudulent contracts, offshore bank transfers, and even emails between Daniel and Jason detailing the sabotage. Daniel's confident demeanor began to falter as he glanced at the papers, a mix of contempt and unease crossing his face. "Impressive documentation," he said, attempting to maintain his composure. "But not enough to take me down." It was a bluff, and Matthew knew it. He just needed to buy time. Outside, a team of police officers and auditors waited for the signal to move in. As Matthew kept Daniel occupied, he knew the wheels were already in motion to expose all of Daniel's fraudulent activities. "Do you think I came here unprepared?" Matthew asked, leaning forward. Right now, your company is under investigation, your accounts are frozen, and your reputation, well, that's gone. The blow landed, but Daniel tried to strike back. This is just a game, Matthew. And I've always been better at it than you. Before Daniel could continue, the police entered the restaurant. The lead officer approached the table with a stern expression. Daniel Harrington, you are under arrest for corporate fraud, conspiracy, and attempted homicide, he announced as he placed handcuffs on Daniel. The once confident man tried to resist, but it was futile. He looked at Matthew, his eyes burning with hatred. You think you won? This isn't over, he snarled as he was led away. But Matthew knew Daniel's words were empty, the sound of a man who had already lost. As the restaurant fell silent again, Matthew felt a wave of exhaustion mixed with relief. He had won this battle, but he knew the damage Daniel had done would take time to repair. Claire, who had been waiting outside, walked in to join him. She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You did it, she said with a warm smile. Matthew exhaled deeply. We did it, he corrected. Without her, he knew he wouldn't have come this far. Back at the mansion, Matthew found Emily waiting for him. She looked smaller somehow, as if the recent events had drained her completely. I know I can't undo what I've done, she began, her voice trembling. But I want you to know I never meant to hurt you. Matthew listened in silence, wrestling with his own emotions. He knew Emily had made mistakes, but this wasn't the time to decide their future. I need time, he said finally. Emily nodded, resigned. Perhaps she already knew time wouldn't change anything. In the days that followed, Matthew began rebuilding his life. With Jason behind bars and Daniel facing criminal charges, the company was safe, but there was still much work to be done. Claire remained by his side, helping him reorganize the business and regain the trust of investors. Beyond the professional, though, something else was growing between them. The time they had spent together during the crisis had forged a bond neither could ignore. One evening, after a long day at the office, Matthew invited Claire to dinner. It was a simple gesture, but it carried significant meaning. At the restaurant, they talked about everything except work. Claire, usually so composed, seemed more relaxed, and Matthew felt more at ease than he had in weeks. During a quiet moment, he looked at her and said, Claire, you were the only person I could trust through all of this. And that means more to me than I can put into words. Claire smiled, but there was something deeper in her eyes, something Matthew finally recognized. As they walked back to the car after dinner, Matthew found his courage. He took her hand, stopping in the middle of the sidewalk. I don't know what the future holds, he said sincerely, but I know I want you to be a part of it. Claire looked surprised, but didn't hesitate. I want that too, Matthew, she replied with a smile. In that moment, the millionaire realized that despite everything he had lost, he had gained something priceless. The case against Daniel continued in court, but Matthew knew his victory was more than just evidence or convictions. He had reclaimed control of his life, discovered strength he didn't know he had, and most importantly, learned the true value of the people around him. Life as a millionaire wasn't just about material wealth. It was about choices, connections, and the courage to face even the harshest truths. The silence of the mansion, so familiar yet strangely foreign, seemed to embrace Matthew as he stepped through the front door that evening. The soft lights illuminated the hallways, but something had changed. It wasn't the surroundings, it was him. After everything he had endured, betrayals, conspiracies, and losses, Matthew felt as though something inside him was finally starting to click into place. He glanced around, and a flash of memory surfaced, a night years ago, when he received the contract that had made him a millionaire. The face of an old mentor flitted across his mind, like a shadow lit by the faint glow. It was a beginning. In the days that followed, fragments continued to emerge, like scattered pieces of a puzzle. Sometimes it was a scent that brought him back to an important meeting. Other times, a word or a name revived significant moments. Claire noticed the changes. As they worked together reorganizing documents in the office, Matthew paused suddenly, holding an old report. "I remember this," he said, almost surprised. "This is where we started diversifying our investments." Claire looked at him, offering an encouraging smile. "Your memory is returning," she said softly. "Slowly, but it's happening." With Claire by his side, the transition became more bearable. Their relationship, which had blossomed in the chaos, was now solidifying on calmer ground. They shared meals in the living room, talked about the future, and explored new ways to rebuild the company. Claire was a constant presence, but never intrusive. She encouraged him to explore his memories at a pace he felt comfortable with. "There's no rush," she would say when Matthew seemed frustrated. "What matters is what you do with what you already know." One sunny morning, while walking through the mansion's gardens, another fragment surfaced. He remembered purchasing the property. Victoria's voice echoed in his mind, suggesting colors for the rooms and discussing details he hadn't understood at the time. It was a bittersweet moment. While he was glad to regain pieces of his history, he knew some memories would bring more pain than relief. Claire, walking beside him, noticed his expression. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked. Matthew shook his head. "Not yet," he replied, but he knew he would eventually have to face it all. As his memory gradually returned, Matthew began to see the world with fresh eyes. He decided that rebuilding the company wasn't enough. He wanted to transform it. With Claire's help, he implemented programs to support his employees, including educational opportunities and wellness initiatives. During a board meeting, he was direct. "We have the resources to change lives. Let's use them." Many were surprised by his approach, but initial resistance quickly turned into admiration. The once distant millionaire was now a leader who inspired. The memories of his accident came back in flashes. First, the sensation of speed, the sound of screeching tires, then darkness. It was during sleep, in a vivid dream, that he finally remembered the critical moment. The brakes failing, the panic, the car flipping. He awoke breathless, but relieved. The most crucial piece of the puzzle had returned. The next morning, he shared this with Claire, who held his hand firmly. "Now you know you survived something that should have destroyed you," she said. "And that makes you stronger than you realize." Matthew also began revisiting places he had once considered insignificant, but now seemed laden with meaning. He went to a charitable foundation he had created years ago, but had recently neglected. There, he saw children whose education was being funded by his company. One boy recognized him from photos on the wall and approached timidly. "You're the man who helped my mom," the child said. Matthew was speechless, but the moment touched him deeply. He realized that his fortune was more valuable than he'd imagined, not for its size, but for the impact it could have. Claire remained his anchor, but their relationship was evolving. It was no longer a partnership forged in chaos. It had become something genuine, built on trust and affection. On a quiet evening, as they gazed at the stars from the garden, Matthew took her hand. "You've been my rock," he said sincerely. "I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you." Claire smiled, but didn't respond immediately. She knew Matthew was still healing, but she also knew he was on the right path. As news of Daniel and Jason's arrests finally settled, Matthew felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. He knew both men would face years of legal consequences, and that his company was safe from the conspiracies that had nearly destroyed it. More importantly, he knew he had regained more than just his memory. He had reclaimed himself. The millionaire who had once been defined by his wealth now understood that his true riches lay in the connections he formed and the positive impact he could create. That night, as Claire closed the documents they had been reviewing together, Matthew called her to the piano in the living room. He played a simple melody, something he had just remembered from his childhood. Claire listened intently, sitting beside him. "This was my mother's favorite song," he said with a nostalgic smile. "I think I'm starting to remember who I really am." Claire took his hand, and the two sat in silence, letting the music fill the space between them. Matthew knew his journey was far from over. There was still much work to do, both in the company and in his personal life. But for the first time, he was ready to face it all. The millionaire who had once defined himself by his wealth now understood that his greatest treasure lay in the memories he created, the people he loved, and the lessons he chose to embrace. With Claire by his side, he knew the future was something to be built, one day at a time. And so concludes the journey of Matthew Johnson, a millionaire who faced betrayals, losses, and challenges that nearly destroyed him, but who, in the end, found himself. His story serves as a powerful reminder that what defines us is not what we possess, but how we choose to act on our experiences. Matthew didn't just rebuild his life, he transformed it. And alongside Claire, he discovered that true wealth lies in the connections we nurture and the choices we make, even in the hardest moments. Now it's your turn. What did you think of this story? Have you ever faced moments where you had to reinvent yourself, just like Matthew? Which lessons resonated with you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. They might inspire others and offer new perspectives. If you enjoyed this journey full of twists, mystery, and emotion, don't forget to like this video and share it with friends who love compelling stories. And to stay updated on more content like this, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when new, incredible stories are released. Before you go, check out the next video appearing on your screen now. I'm sure it will resonate with you just as deeply and help you discover new paths forward. Together, let's turn stories into lessons and inspiration. Thank you so much for watching.